Well, good
So
morning,
true.
all. Good morning, all, and welcome. This is our fourth week in our migration webinar series, and we are pleased that you are either here with us live or watching a recording. And you can find the full description of our series out at bcfl.net. And our fourth session today on March 23rd is with Dr. Hasford from Ontario, Canada. We're excited that he is here with us. And on behalf of Video Conferencing for Global Learning and the Global Video Conference Ed Group, and with appreciation to Zoom and my co-conspirators, Dr. Khadijah Williams, Dr. Claudette Crawford-Brown, and Mr. Sidney Henry, I'm thrilled that you are joining us for this important series. And with that, I am going to toss it over to Dr. Khadijah Williams to introduce our primary speaker today.
Good morning, everyone. And today we have Dr. Hasford, who is from the Ryerson University Child and Youth Care Department. And he's here to talk about his research and his experience working with young Black migrants in Canada. He's a partner of Village Academy, his department, and we have collaborated as well on this project for him to present to you young people. So thank you for being here. And well, Dr. Hasford, all the best.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crawford-Brown, and to Dr. Williams as well, for welcoming me and for inviting me to be part of this very important, conversation. I am, as folks have said, a assistant professor in the School of Child and Youth Care at Ryerson University. And for the last several years, I've been involved in some research and community activism that focuses on issues faced by Black youth and families in the child welfare system. And I'll talk a little bit about how the child welfare system works in Ontario, the province. It's a part of Canada where I'm from, and what some of the experiences have been of what we typically refer to as Black or African Caribbean and Black families within the sector, but then include a specific focus on issues of migration. But what I really will focus largely on, towards the tail end, at least, of my talk, is some interventions and some strategies that we've looked at putting in place to improve the way we serve Black families who end up, within the system. And of course, I'll leave a lot of time. I'll talk for maybe 15, 20 minutes or so. And then, of course, I'll really look forward to any conversations and questions that folks have at the end. So I do have a PowerPoint, which I will post right now. Okay, so I assume folks can see my screen, okay? Thank you. All right. Okay, so before I get into it, I just want to share a few quick definitions to make sure we're on the same page, because coming from a different jurisdiction, I do know sometimes we use terminology differently. And so in a Canadian context, when we talk about people who are Black, right, or people who are of African descent, one of the terms that's increasingly being used is African Caribbean and Black populations, right? And we use this as an inclusive term for people from sub-Saharan African descent, regardless of what their ethnicity is or their place of birth, right? And it comes from a lot of the health literature in Europe and in North America. And the reason we use this as a broad term is because, at least in Canada and in certain parts of Canada, which is very multicultural, and you have people coming from various parts of the diaspora, people have their own ways of identifying, right? Some choose to identify as African, some prefer the label of Caribbean, some prefer the label of Black. And so rather than assigning, a particular term or label, we use this as a comprehensive term. Now, in my own work, I do tend to use Black as a shorthand, so that's probably what I'll say anyway. But increasingly, we're trying to kind of change our language to be more reflective of the diversity within the community. Another term that will center my work and what I'll be speaking about today is the notion of anti-Black racism. And now, of course, within what's happened over the last year in terms of the kind of uprising around anti-Black racism, a lot of folks are familiar with this concept, given, you know, what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement and the murder of George Floyd in the US. There's been a public outcry. And so a lot of the research that I've done around child welfare focuses on anti-Black racism and the way it functions in the child welfare system, which of course has significant implications for migrant families as well, who come from, you know, predominantly Black countries. And so when we talk about anti-Black racism, we're referring to a specific form of prejudice and discrimination that involves a specific set of beliefs, myths, attitudes, behaviors, practices, and policies that negatively target African, Caribbean, and Black people. Okay, and so the origin of these ideas and these myths we have about Black people, which I'm sure folks on the call are quite familiar with, stem from European colonization and enslavement of Black people, and the development of certain myths and stereotypes and policies and practices that were aimed at maintaining white supremacy and maintaining the subordination of Black people. But that's not a historical phenomenon. Of course, it's continued to evolve and shift the way it looks and its forms within our institutions, but anti-Black racism continues to be a significant influence and impingement on the lives of people of African descent. And then finally, the main term I just want to highlight as well is the notion of what we call institutional racism. So often when folks think about racism as a phenomenon, we think about it in terms of the interpersonal, right? Certain biases in our attitudes and the way one person might treat another, whether that be through name calling or ignoring them or refusing, you know, to hire them on a job or whatever. But we also, in a lot of the work that I looks at institutional racism. So not only in terms of how racism functions between individuals, but also how institutions and organizations can themselves be racist, okay? So the definition that I provided here, it comes from Dr. Kwame Mackenzie, who's also an African Canadian. And he says that institutional racism, number one, it's an ecological form of discrimination, meaning again, that it goes above and beyond individuals, right? It speaks to how it functions in communities and organizations. And that one of the main things to understand when we identify institutional racism is that it involves inequitable outcomes or disparities and disproportionalities for different racialized groups. So whenever we see that there is an overrepresentation of Black or migrant families within a particular system, such as child welfare, in comparison to other groups, that in itself is an indicator of institutional racism. Okay, there's something happening within that organization or within the society that is producing these inequities. Okay, and then the third pillar is that it also involves a lack of effective action by organizations to eradicate inequitable outcomes. Meaning that when an organization has identified that we have these inequities in outcomes for particular groups, there is an obligation of the state or those organizations to intervene. But when they refuse to do so, that is also a form of institutional racism. Okay, and there's been this history of the child welfare system in Canada being aware of the fact that we do have an overrepresentation of Black families, but until very recently, there's been largely inaction on that issue. So just for context, for folks who might not be familiar with Canada and the context of African Canadians here, so within Canada, African Caribbean and Black Canadians are the third largest visible minority group. So the largest visible minority group are people of South Asian descent, you know, from India predominantly. The second largest is people of Asian descent, largely Chinese. And then the third are Black populations. And we comprise about 1.2 million population overall and represent about 3.5% of the general population. Okay, so Canada, you know, it's we have a population of about 30 million people, which I understand is about equivalent to the state of New York. So, you know, it's it's kind of a drop in the bucket in comparison to the US population. But we do still have a sizable, you know, Black or population, especially when we consider the geographic distribution, because the vast majority, over 90% of African Caribbean and Black populations live within 5 main provinces. And within those provinces, they're largely confined to urban centers. So you will get some communities such as the Toronto, which is Canada's largest city, Peel region, which is a suburb of Toronto, and that's where some of the work I'll talk about fits, where the population is as much as 10% of the local populations. So as you see on this image to the right here, Ontario is Canada's most populous, is largest and heavily populated province. And so over 50% of Black Canadians in Canada reside in Ontario, most of whom within the southern part in Toronto here. The second largest is Quebec, and folks again largely settled in Montreal and to an extent Quebec City. And this is largely people of Haitian descent predominantly, and other Francophone African populations as well. Okay, and then you get smaller populations in some of the other provinces, and I may speak about that shortly. We can talk about it during the Q&A. Now, the population of African, Caribbean, and Black Canadians are extremely diverse, again, in terms of their ethnicity, cultures, languages, and heritage. You know, I heard a recent stat, and I haven't verified it, but I understand that there are well over 200 various Black ethnic groups within who reside within Canada, and ethnic and linguistic groups. And so it's extremely, extremely diverse, and it's probably the most diverse population of Black folks within the world. And so what you see here is about 45%, and many of them are new, right? So a large majority of the African population within Canada are first and second generation immigrants. Almost half of those immigrants come from the Caribbean and Bermuda, about 45%, another 45% from Africa. And then you will see some small this is years of African Caribbean Black populations within Canada have been from the Caribbean and Bermuda, and so we see the demographics starting to shift. Please let me know. I'm getting an internet unstable notice, so if I'm having issues, please let me know, and I'll see if I need to choose. Okay. The largest group of African Canadians does hail from Jamaica. So you can see here, well over a quarter of the population of African Canadians do hail from Jamaica. Haitians comprise the largest group, and then several other ethnicities comprise the remaining proportion. Okay, and that has some implications, particularly the large Jamaican group, for some of the work that we are doing around child welfare. And just a little bit of history. So the presence of, although the vast majority of the current population of African Caribbean Black Canadians have arrived largely since the mid-20th century, the population has a long history within Canada, extending to at least the early 1600s. And so the first documented person of African descent within Canada was a man named Matthew da Costa. He's believed to have been of West African descent. And he was a translator for Portuguese colonists and helped to translate Mi'kmaq language, which is one of the First Nations for some of the colonists when they arrived. And this was in the early 1600s. And since then, there have been various waves of migration, you know, of people of African descent to Canada, or what we call Turtle Island, which is a term that we use to honor and reflect the indigenous identification of the land mass that we currently call Canada. There have been several waves of migration in the subsequent years. This, of course, began with the arrival of enslaved Africans through European colonists in the 17th and 18th century. So Canada is often seen as this bastion of multiculturalism and, you know, tolerance and so forth. But as with the US, Canada does have a history, a significant history of chattel slavery of people of African descent. And then during the 18th and 20th century, there was a migration of Black refugees from the US through the Underground Railroad, as folks may know, as well as Black loyalists who fought during the American Revolution and who arrived largely in the eastern side of Canada. Then into the 20th century, we saw the migration of Black US farm workers, largely from Oklahoma, as well as railroad workers who started to make their way in order to try and escape persecution and Jim Crow laws within the US. And again, as there was this influx of people of African descent into Canada from the US, Canada implemented racist immigration policies to try and keep the nation non-white, right? And their rationale was that they wanted to make sure that people who settled within Canada are folks who could handle the climate. But it was very clearly a policy that was designed to exclude people of African descent from the country. And then from the mid-20th century is where you saw a significant increase of migration, of Black migration to Canada. It began with a West Indian domestic worker scheme where following World War II, there was a need for domestic labor. And so they changed the immigration policies so that people from the West Indies, and largely from Jamaica, and this is why Jamaicans in part are such a large community here, began to migrate to Canada. This was followed by other liberalization policies, which increased in migration from other parts of the world as well. And then what we saw is in the late 20th century, with civil war in Somalia, there was movement of over 30,000 people within a very short time frame of people of Somali descent, Somalians to Canada, Somalian refugees who migrated to Canada and who largely settled in Ontario. So in Canada, like many parts of the world, we have a child welfare, a child protection system, which is designed to protect the safety of children who experience abuse and neglect, right? So meaning if a child is suspected of experiencing abuse from their homes, or the parents aren't considered to be able to meet their adequate needs, then the state has a system in place which can investigate, and if it's deemed necessary, remove the child from the home and place them in the care of a foster parent or a group home or some other space that's supposed to be safer for the young person. But what we found is that over the years, and this really there was a pivotal news story in one of the largest newspapers. They did an investigative study, and they found that in the Toronto Children's Aid Society, over 40% of the children in care of the child welfare system were Black, even though they represented less than 10% of the local population. So that's a 4 times overrepresentation. Remember, we spoke about institutional racism. So that means there's a 4 times overrepresentation of people of African descent within the child welfare system. And so there was a huge public outcry, and that led to a number of ongoing activism, some policy initiatives, and some other types of intervention to try and look at this issue more deeply and develop strategies to mitigate those inequities. What we find is that across the province is that Black families are over 2 times more likely to be we find that across the province, so in Toronto, it's about 40% overrepresentation. But when you look at the province as a whole, Black families are still about 2 times overrepresented within the child welfare system. Okay, and the reasons this happened is very troubling, because often, what is it that leads a person to be reported to the child welfare system is we have professionals in the field who have a responsibility, what we call a duty to report. Meaning if you're a school teacher or you're a doctor, a physician or a social worker, and you meet a young person and they present something which seems like it might be abuse or a neglectful home, then you have a legal obligation to report. What happens is, and we know this in the US as well, is that there's bias which informs the way people interpret risk. So for example, and studies have shown that if, let's say, a Black youth and a white youth present themselves to a doctor, both of them with a bruise on an arm, it doesn't matter necessarily, but a doctor, but they both have a bruise on the arm. If the child is Black, the doctor is more likely to report them to child welfare than if the child is white. Okay. And we've heard stories where children, especially Black children, get reported to the child welfare system for very petty things. Things such as a child who was reported to CAS because they were bringing roti to lunch, roti with no filling. Okay, so I'm sure some folks on the call might know what a roti is. Okay, it's a flatbread. And because the child was coming to school with the roti with no filling, the worker thought, well, this child is being neglected and not being adequately fed at home. Okay. There's stories of children who get a bad grade in the report card and say, oh, my mom is going to kill me, which I've said a million times. Okay, but because it gets interpreted through this notion that Black parents are violent and hostile, right, it gets reported to the child welfare system. Okay, so that's where it begins. But that bias, it compounds throughout the system. Okay, and if you have questions, we can talk about how that happens and what it looks like. Okay, we also know that once they get into the system, African Caribbean and Black children spend more time in care, right? So they tend to be in care much longer than their non-Black counterparts, and that they're less likely to be reunited with family. And that, again, the kind of biases that inform the decision-making occurs throughout the system. Now, when it comes to issues of migration, you know, it gets quite complex in some ways, because we know, number one, that folks who are first generation immigrants, and first and second, but largely first generation, are at higher risk of involvement with the child protection system. Okay, and there are a number of reasons. Number one, of course, is that many newcomers are racialized and are of African descent. And so that in and of itself, because of anti-Black racism, increases their risk. Right. We also know that because some families don't, you know, there are differences in cultural practices of parenting, right, where some folks might still use some types of corporal punishment as a form of discipline. There are issues in terms of language and understanding kind of the policies of the child welfare system, right? So some people actually say, and through some of the research we've done, they said, well, when they said it was child welfare, they called because they thought their role is to help them, right, to help improve the welfare of the child. They didn't realize that this is about an organization that has a mandate to remove children from the home. Okay. And often, especially with refugee populations, these are populations who are arriving with trauma. Okay. And so the trauma and unmet mental health needs also increases the risk. Now, one of the most significant issues that we're dealing with is around issues of citizenship. Because when people arrive to Canada and they don't have permanent residency or they have refugee status, historically, the child welfare system has not been very good at making sure that children, when they're taken into care, get their citizenship and permanency. And so what that means is you have children who are in care of the state who don't have citizenship and permanency. And what that means is they don't get full access to healthcare coverage. They face barriers to post-secondary education, right? For example, you need permanency or citizenship to get access to certain types of funding, okay? Access to other types of financial assistance, right? Social assistance, and disability supports, okay, employment, and others, right? So that lack of citizenship really is a major barrier to young people's integration within Canadian society. And then it produces, in particular, a risk for increased deportation. So what you see here on the right, it was a recent story. It started a couple of years ago, where there was this young man, Abdul Abdi, and his sister. They arrived in Canada from Somalia in the year 2000. They were refugees from, again, the civil war and upheaval that was happening in that country. So they arrived with their aunts in 2000. And this is on the eastern part of Canada, Nova Scotia. Now they enter the school system, and as you can imagine, right, it's a predominantly white school system, and so they experienced major forms of bullying and anti-Black racism from other children in the school and from the teachers as well. So they didn't feel welcomed. They didn't have much in terms of language, you know, in addition, and so they felt very isolated within the school. So the aunts decided, well, this school is not a safe environment, so they removed the children from the school system, not knowing that they had a legal obligation to keep the children in school. So child welfare got involved and removed the children from the home. And so the children became essentially wards of the state. So you can imagine, of course, when you're within these kind of homes, you are placed with other children who have experienced trauma and so forth. And so it's a very traumatic kind of environment. It's not necessarily the healthiest set of homes. So over the years, once he became a young man in his 20s, he got charged with an assault. Just given the trauma, folks often engage in violence as a way of coping, as we know. He was charged with assault and spent 4 years in jail. And what came to light is that over the 20 years or so that he had been in care, he had been in 31 different homes. No one had applied for his citizenship. So he was still a youth within the system, but had no documentation. So once he was released, his sentence was over. The government had planned to deport him back to Somalia, which of course is a huge injury and a huge risk when you think about kind of the state of civil unrest in that country, that continues. And so when that became a public issue, there was a lot of community mobilization and activism, and the government has actually stayed his deportation, and the government of Nova Scotia, the province that he was based in, has actually shifted its policy and now requires social workers to apply to prioritize the application for citizenship rights for children who are undocumented. And then, of course, the other dimension, so you have kind of the citizenship dimension. Another key issue around migration and the child welfare system is, as I'm sure folks have heard from Dr. Crawford Brown and her work around barrel children and issues of family separation, right? Because many of the children who are involved within the CAS, and the vast majority are from Jamaica, who are Black children are from Jamaica, are driven because of parent-child conflict. So for example, this work that I'm doing, I'll talk about momentarily, we have somewhere between 60 to 70% of the cases we are working with is driven by parent-child conflict, right? And a significant proportion, we don't have exactly the figures yet, but we suspect a significant proportion of that group are children who have experienced some type of parent-child family separation, which leads to conflict. Because if a parent has arrived in Canada and sponsors a child to follow them, or sometimes vice versa, that separation point, it breeds, not only is it traumatic, the family separation in and of itself, but then the effort to try and reunite the family, who is stressed by the context of anti-Black racism, the settlement challenges and so forth, institutional intervention, can produce parent-child conflict, right? And so when parents don't have the resources, sometimes the state will get involved. Okay. So the program, what's happened is, so within the region I live in, it's called Peel Region. It's a suburb of Toronto. And what we have done is, through an advocacy group that I've been involved in, is collaborated. We've done a partnership with the local child welfare system, an initiative we call Pulling Together, which is basically a strategy to work with various community stakeholders to try and mitigate the overrepresentation of Black families in the child welfare sector, including, of course, Caribbean families and migrant families as well. And so the initiative includes three main components. One is what's called a System Leaders Roundtable. So this includes executive leaders of various sectors, because the issue of Black overrepresentation within the child welfare system is not just a child welfare issue. It's an education system issue, because school teachers are one of the main referral sources to child welfare. It's a policing issue because they're a second main referring issue, right? Involves the courts, right? The family courts, mental health as well, because often it's unmet mental health needs, which can lead to child welfare concerns and others. So we've brought executive leaders from various sectors together to look at the issue from a policy perspective and say, okay, what is it that we need to do to interrupt and disrupt this process? Second is, we've piloted what's called the Akoma Wraparound service. And then I'll speak shortly to what exactly that is in a minute. But essentially, it's a model of what sometimes called restorative practice, where when a family gets referred to CAS, the child welfare system, instead of removing the child from the home, unless there are very, very serious issues, of course, we will try and build around the family wraparound. We wrap supports around the family, supports that will really meet the mental health needs or housing needs or childcare needs, whatever it is, right? We listen to what the family needs, really their core needs are and their goals, and then we wrap those services around the family to help meet those needs. And then the third is community capacity building. So within these various tables, we bring community stakeholders together so that Black communities, organizations that are led by Black folks or that are serving other Black communities, develop the skills to be able to serve families more effectively. Okay. So, the Akoma wraparound, essentially, Akoma is, so I'm from Ghana originally. And so Akoma is like a term which means heart, okay? And this symbol you see on the left is what we call in my culture, a dinkra, which is like a symbol that reflects certain values or philosophies, okay? And so this means the Akoma Intoso, which is like linked hearts. So we just use this name as a label for the program, the wraparound, because we're linking hearts together. And the aim is to, by linking people, is to reduce those racial inequities and improve outcomes for Black families through culturally centered and a team-based support model, right? And we actually developed this in consultation with community. So we held several meetings with over 300 folks at various parts of our local community to get their feedback in terms of what they thought Black families need in order to address, anti-Black racism. And we said, well, we need a wraparound model, and this is what we've come up with. And so the model, it's been piloted for about a year. It involves, and we're still, refining it, but the vision is to include joint protection visits with CAS and child protection workers, meaning that if a child gets reported to child welfare, typically, historically, it's been the CAS has gone out to the home and said, okay, what's going on here, more or less. But what we want to do is actually have another community person who can go with the child welfare worker as well, so that there's more sensitive lens, culturally sensitive lens when we're investigating, what is happening, with a particular family. There's also an emphasis on Afrocentric parenting and informal networking supports. So as much as possible, when a family gets referred to this program, we help them to try and locate culturally appropriate services that have an African-centered lens within the community to help them meet their needs. There's a focus on social determinants. So when we talk about social determinants, we mean those other aspects of health, those other aspects of life that shape our health. Again, the housing, the education, the employment, right? All of those other pieces we also really center in the work. Okay, and then we also do advocacy for people as well. And this slide is really just a summary of some of the figures to date in terms of, what we've delivered. We've served 95 families so far, which includes 166 children and youth. Again, it's prioritized the housing, employment. Food security has also been an important need that's identified. And it's involved over 1,000 hours of direct service support, making connections with over 106 caregivers, right? So we look within the family to see what kind of internal resources the family might have to help them realize their potential and their needs. And that's been really achievement and kind of a notable dimension of this project. And it's an aspect we're kind of scaling up. And then I've included within that counseling supports as well. So I think I've gone a little bit beyond the 15 minutes I had intended, but I do want to save some time for questions. So I'll hold it there.
Wow, there's a lot of very powerful and hopeful information within your presentation. Initially, I'm listening to some of the institutional racism bits and taking that in and gosh, I don't know what the negative term is to use for that. It's escaping me right now, but really kind of feeling poorly about that. But at the end, I love this sense of hopefulness that I developed from what you had to share. And I hope that as we go forward with this conversation, we'll see some of that come out from some of the other participants in the webinar, especially from the students. I'm intrigued to see, and I hope that they will chime in soon, intrigued to see what their questions and comments are. And I will chime in with some of my own, but I eventually, if they stay on mute, which I hope they don't do, but we'll see. I see some of our folks there from the Village Academy with Brian Brown's group in. Any of you at this point should feel free to unmute and chime in, and those who are in as attendees are welcome to use chat to make comments or ask questions. Please do so as I continue to ramble. I am waiting for you to engage.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
When he mentioned the part with, the high average, my first thought was exactly that. In terms of Caribbean parents have techniques or styles of parenting that may be misconstrued sometimes as abuse.
Yes.
And many times people feel, well, okay, you can't do certain things, but discipline is not abuse. And sometimes people don't have that line of, well, okay, what is abuse? So you talk to your child a little harsh and people think it's abuse, or, and I guess that is probably one of the reasons why a large number of children are taken away in the Canadian setting.
Yes. Absolutely, absolutely. Parental discipline and, again, kind of the conflict between the parent and the child is a major driver. And as you said, and it's a complex issue, right? Right. Historically, we've developed certain practices in terms of discipline, but it's definitely not intended to be abusive, right? It's about discipline, and it's about different kind of historical reference point in terms of how do you teach a child to follow rules and to be self-controlled and so forth. And so it's problematic when a state which is very Eurocentric, right, and it's increasingly acknowledging that this is a very European way of thinking about parenting, we use that as a criteria to discipline a child. So it's about an education process and helping folks to reassess, how do we assess really what is abuse versus what is discipline. It's not always clean, but this is why when you have somebody from the community who understands the culture, who is part of the decision-making process, it can help to kind of address some of those nuances.
Could I jump in here on that? Having worked, I not only work as an academic, but I worked as a practitioner in the New Jersey system for 4 years. And one of the issues that came up was this very issue. It had to do with, I have a number of case studies of Trinidadians, Jamaican mothers who, take up something and fling. Child is not washing up the dishes, and so she takes something and she just throws. And the mother took up a shoe or a sneaker and took it and threw at the child. And as a result of that, that child was taken into care, mother was reprimanded in the court system, etc. And so what I did in the New Jersey system, and I propose for other systems, is the need for training. I did this in Connecticut, I did this in New Jersey. And what they did, they asked me to come in and do cultural sensitivity training, because I think they mean well, but they just don't understand. Because in the Caribbean, you take up a shoe and you throw it at a child, the child will just duck it and that's it. But it's not a serious abusive gesture. It's almost playful. And so what I've found over the past 3 decades is that I've had to be constantly going in to develop cultural competence among workers in the US and Canadian system. My first lecture was at McGill University in Montreal, talking exactly about this issue, because it's simply a matter of there are different cultures in the Caribbean, and our way of life is very, very different from your typical your Pan-African and your Caribbean culture, very, very different from what your mainstream Canadian or North American culture is. And it's a simple matter of just having conversations and understanding that how we live is different. The other thing that happens is that people tend to mix up and conflate the culture of the Caribbean with the culture of African Americans. And that's what I find in North America. So I wondered whether you saw anything like that happening with the generations of Black Canadians and Caribbean, if you saw any disparities between those, and how did it play out in issues like in terms of cultural differences between the groups. I noticed you have put that group ACB, and I was wondering if you saw any difference between African, Caribbean, and or native Black cultures, because I found tensions in Connecticut, Northeast Coast between Black Americans and Caribbean people. There are still nuances and differences there that one has to have conversations about, particularly when you're providing delivery of child welfare services. Yes. Did you find anything like that?
Absolutely. So in some ways now, you see, and again, it speaks to the migration patterns. So we see predominantly what we might call the native African Canadians, so those who kind of migrated initially from the US, have settled largely in Nova Scotia, which is a province on the East Coast, and then to some extent in the Midwestern in Alberta as well. So in Ontario, there are some pockets, but there's not really a large population, particularly in the area the work that we've been doing. However, now there is, we know, particularly in Nova Scotia, a long history of overrepresentation of Black family involvement within child welfare due to systemic racism. So the overall patterns are the same, but the dynamics, I think, are a bit different. Now, in the Peel area, the Greater Toronto area, some of the differences and nuances we see are between people who are of continental African descent and then people who have Caribbean descent. There's not, although there is still patterns of serial migration, I don't think that's as much as a driver. There are still issues of parent-child conflict, which still drives some of their involvement, but it's not necessarily connected to the serial migration. And then when it comes to the parenting practices and thinking of how you develop culturally relevant services, it's around issues of language, issues of religion, right? Issues of culturally appropriate type of services. So increasingly, there's a recognition that there is no one size fits all. You can't have a Black program, and that's good enough, right? The culturally tailored programs have to be ethno-specific. And so we've actually, been reaching out, and we also have a significant Francophone Black population as well. So again, language is a significant factor as well. And so increasingly, we're trying to recruit and mobilize ethno-specific community partners to help us in developing those more ethno-specific interventions, including the Somali community, including, again, Francophone African communities, and other kind of continental Africans in particular. I think because the West Indies, the Caribbean have a significant history and presence within, Ontario and Canada, they have a lot of institutions and cultural programs. And so there's kind of an existing tradition of serving those families. But when the continental Africans, they're much newer as a community. And so there's much more effort being put in that direction. That's a great question. Thank you.
So we'll try again, I'll ramble for a moment, hoping that we are
I do have something.
Okay, excellent, wonderful.
So this sort of links back to what Dr. Crawford, what you were saying last week about developing that sense of community in the destination country. So for what Dr. Hasfield, what you're saying is that the pulling together the Akoma Wraparound program is basically providing a sense of community for those new immigrants who don't already have that established community base where they haven't already integrated. And not only is it meant to provide them with support in a way that they understand, but also to help them navigate this new system that they've been put into. Mm-hmm. How does that work now with the already integrated communities who have been long established?
Okay, great question. So what we are trying to do, you've actually foregrounded kind of the direction we're moving in, is so when part of the impetus or the emphasis of the wraparound is to include what we call informal supports. Mm-hmm. So these are service supports that fall outside of the formal service sector, professional driven service sector, right? The mental health counselors, the psychiatrists, etc. And so within that informal supports, we're actually now beginning to look at piloting what they're calling an aunties and uncles program, where we all have, right, that extended family, whether auntie by blood or uncle by blood. Auntie is auntie, right? Uncle is uncle. And so we're saying, okay, we have folks within the community who have resources, who understand Canadian culture and society and system navigation, who have their own networks, right? And so how do we create an expanded aunties and uncles network that these families can have access to, right? So people who are from your local community, they might not be related by blood or not, but who can still serve as that informal, long-term, right, support that's unconditional. And that's really what family is about, right? That unconditional love and support. We just don't necessarily we haven't made the connections between people. So that's kind of the direction we're moving into, fill that gap.
I understand. There's something else I wanted to mention. When we talk about the difference between abuse and a discipline, the difference between the two. Now, I 100% will admit that there is, in fact, discipline issues that border on abusive, and it's coming from, okay, well, it's okay to just take one step further because you're coming from a culture where, and this is the thing, where a culture where speaking loudly at your children is not the same as shouting and berating them. We can distinguish between the two. When I was younger, we would say that our phone number was 654 ball hard, shout, just shout across the street to your neighbor or to your uncle or to your aunt. And because that loudness, that vociferousness, that aggressiveness is just part of our culture, part of our nature. But to go, and then you have to meter that as a child and as a parent and that's the thing, the parents are put under stress continuously. No matter what family you're in, no matter how well adjusted, you will have issues between parent and child. It's a very difficult thing now to separate that natural vociferous and aggressiveness that probably comes with being in a hot country, and compare that to what actually borders on abuse.
Yes.
Because there are different forms of abuse. You can shout at a child to the point where they're breaking down mentally and emotionally. You can be physically abusive, you can be emotionally abusive. And it's really hard to make that distinction, particularly when a young child is now growing up in a country where they're seeing other young children being treated a particular way, but the parent themselves can't make that adjustment. So would the Wraparound program now include official parenting practices and other techniques?
Absolutely, yes. So part of it is to either refer them to parenting programs. And so one of the partners for this wraparound, they have a culturally, it's a Caribbean focused, parenting program. And so families can get referred to that. It's like almost like a peer support kind of parenting, initiative to help address and mitigate some of those issues. Because we recognize that, yes, although it may have certain cultural origins and it may have certain, again, if we think about intergenerational trauma, right, and the ways in which historical violence has impacted Black and Caribbean families and how that's shaped parenting over time, some of those factors have to be weighed into consideration as well. So certainly we want to look at it. The key, of course, being that we want to avoid as much as possible state intervention, because once you get involved within the state, that in itself is a different type of violence and stress, which will remain with families for many, many, many years. Thank you.
Related to that, I think ties really well into this piece of the conversation. There's a note from Consuela Ricketts that reads, quote, "Our culture in Jamaica needs to change as it relates to dealing with children. Parents need to be educated on how to deal with children in the right way. I'm an educator and I have seen too much abuse of children with the excuse of that is how they were brought up."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that relates really closely to that dynamic that you're mentioning, Risa, and ties into all the rest of it as well. This sense of both trying to define that line that is a cultural way of behaving, and where does that even if it is cultural, where does that culture need to change to avoid being abusive to the child or to the other? It's a really, really, really tricky in all kinds of
Exactly.
I remember years of conversation in my area about corporal punishment in schools. Where was it acceptable for a teacher to physically hit a student, and when was it not, and why is that not okay? So these things have been percolating around in a lot of different ways, and in that cultural context and the differences in cultures, it gets really, really tricky. And students, please unmute, and other presenters, please feel free to unmute as we go forward. Otherwise, you're going to have to listen to me, and I really don't want that.
Mr. Kava, I wanted to also highlight a point and very significant presentation, very appropriate, very relevant to the times as well, Dr. Hasford. And it takes me back to the case of Victoria Climby in the UK in the early 2000s, and all the implications around culture and what went wrong in the childcare system that led to the death of this young child. And the whole issue around her coming from Africa and the perceptions of the social workers at the time and so on. Very important. But I want to ask the young people who are here today, though, because I listened to quite a few of them at my school talk about the dreams of going abroad and working and so on. And I want to ask you, as you listen, young people, what are the implications of all that Dr. Hasford has highlighted in his presentation? What do you think are some of the implications for you in your preparation for migration, in your assimilating to a new country, a new culture? We'd like to hear from you. Javina, I see you there. Sarafina, Imari, is Brian still there? I'd like to hear some of your comments, because I know some of you are really thinking about migration from Jamaica. But what does this mean? You know, getting all this information so that you don't become part of the system. US. Any comments? You can text as well. Or I also see we have Osaze here. Osaze. Yeah, Javina's hand is up. I see Javina.
Yes,
Go ahead,
Miss.
Javina.
Can you please repeat back the question that you were asking, because the internet was moving a bit
Right.
bad.
So I said, in light of what Dr. Hasford has shared in terms of his presentation and the implications, you know, like he's so showing the high percentage of Jamaicans who are represented in the welfare system and so on. And I know a lot of young people are thinking about migration. What does this mean for you? What did you hear in the presentation today? What are some of the things that as young people you need to consider as you wish to migrate, so that you do not become part of a welfare system or a juvenile justice system? That's the question. Any thoughts?
All right. Okay. Yes, I do have a thought. During this presentation, I was thinking a lot about the migration. So one thing, why young people normally study out here in the Caribbean, then go overseas to further their education, is because there are more jobs and there are more employment over there, and there are more opportunities, right? So, but what I would advise for them not to stay there and build a mindset, okay, I will be staying out here and not going back to my country. No, that wouldn't be helpful. I would advise them to basically have the mindset to go over there, work, save some money, and then send it back to their country that they were before. And that would actually be better for them. You understand?
Dr. Hasford, that's yours.
Yes.
Comment?
Oh, no, definitely. I think, you know, you raise it's a very important, you know, issue, and one that's kind of dear to my heart and complementary, right? Because, I mean, we know what drives people right outside of their countries to migrate elsewhere to the north or to the west. But then often we don't necessarily think about, you know, the migration back and how we can give back to our communities and build, you know, over the long term. So it's exciting to hear you think about it that way. You know, and even for us, you know, as we do, our own advocacy and stuff is built around local communities, but increasingly we're thinking about how do we connect overseas and abroad. You know, we have some interests, Dr. Williams and I, around issues of food, you know, and how we use food to engage youth and build community. And that's a passion area. And we're thinking about, okay, how do we connect with Jamaica, or in my case, Ghana, to again kind of build food economies, right, based on the resources that we've invested and that we've learned here. How can we transfer, you know, some of those resources back home and help build capacity locally? So yeah, it's very exciting to hear you think that way.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we see Osaze's hand is up. Osaze, thank you again, Javina. Osaze, all yours.
Good morning, good day to all the panelists. So I just wanted to add, okay, so as Dr. Haskell would have said, you know, everyone knows the reasons or what draws people to migrate to go elsewhere. But I feel like, okay, so one of the reasons that people might migrate or choose to go elsewhere is, you know, the kind of opportunities you could get elsewhere and the kind of work you could be done. And, you know, so sometimes we lose some of our like best minds because, you know, they feel like they could do more or have like a bigger impact on the world elsewhere. Because it's kind of hard to convince some like bright young people that, you know, they could impact the world from within this thought in the world. But what I think is important is that, you know, these same people who would want to go away to have this impact need to realize that there are opportunities elsewhere, but the opportunities in the region and in Trinidad and Jamaica, they're not going to make itself. You know, you would also have to contribute to making your own opportunities and you know, creating, giving that impact for yourself. You can't just look for opportunities because, as you yourself already know, the opportunities might not already exist. So, you know, you would have to try to create opportunities for yourself and for others. But I mean, at the moment, it's kind of hard to convince like some, like I would have gone to school with some of the brightest people in the country. I could say for them, and you know, sometimes it's really hard to say, well, you know, you should stay over this other opportunity you have or something like that.
Yes, I think it's a very thoughtful question. Dr. Crawford Brown, were you going to respond?
Dr.
I think you're
I'm just going to say something very quickly about how to, I think that's an excellent point raised by Ozaze. And perhaps in terms of solutions, the kinds of interventions that Dr. Hasford has been putting forward in the Canadian area with the wraparound services provided by his very interesting organization could include some kind of sensitization and education for the youth when they come. I had something called a new arrivals program in Connecticut, and I'm wondering if we couldn't do something like this, what we're doing now, but in a very psychoeducational way. Provide stimulating, supportive sessions for the new arrivals, which would say to him, listen, you are here for this purpose, be focused, we will support you. You are beautifully, wonderfully made, you know, empowering them. And we hope that you will be able to return to your countries of origin and give something back. If you don't even return, can you do summer camps? Can you do something where you would craft a program? I did this in Connecticut very successfully. And we crafted a new arrivals program that was psychologically supporting, empowering to the young people who come in, so that when they came, you give them that kind of Ozazi speak at the beginning. And you give them you tell them about their support services and the legal services. So it be legal services, social services, psychological services, etc. And what you do is, we as Caribbean people, we can work virtually, empower the children when they come and their families. And I think we have to realize that if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. And so I would like to use this forum and use the idea of this forum as a starting point. We have resource persons all over the Caribbean and the world. Why don't we think in terms of developing a program which could supplement and complement your program, Dr. Hasford, which could provide the kind of inspirational, motivational talks, etc., along with the psychosocial support, and give them help along the lines that Ozazi is speaking about. We have to empower ourselves. We have to be able to, give back to the others who haven't come yet, who are the barrel children waiting. So the barrel children phenomenon incorporated what was happening in the host country, but also spoke a lot to, if you look at the readings, to the reunification process and what happens in the country of origin. I'm sorry, we spoke about, and everybody thinks about barrel children in the country of origin. But a lot of the reading, if you read it, a lot of it spoke about what happens in the host country once the child is reunited. And this is where I think Dr. Hasford's excellent program could be supplemented by a, motivation speak kind of content. Just wanted to throw that in the mix and see what the other young people thought about that. Think about that.
I'm going to jump in here.
So far, we have Javina's hand is up. We have Javina, and then we have Riza. Miss Bihari, yes.
But before we get there, I want to read something from Imari, which I think is right on.
Oh,
in
he's
terms of this
okay.
bit of the conversation and
Mhm.
ties all of this together. From Amari, I think that before traveling, we should consider the rate of racism of that certain country or area and know our rights that we have. Because in one of
Excellent.
the slides on Dr. Hasford's presentations, the children
Right.
didn't know their rights. Absolutely.
Excellent point.
Absolutely, yes. And so
Excellent point, Imari. And therefore, what
Right.
she's saying,
So
Imari is
if
saying
that
we
is
need to
pushed in,
empower ourselves around child rights, around human rights. Human rights, yeah. Before
right.
you even travel and starting from today at school, you all are engaged in civic studies, civic, social studies. It's very relevant that the curriculum is there to learn about child rights, human rights, and responsibilities. So excellent point raised by Imari as well.
So then let's go
Dr.
to
Crawford
Javina.
Brown, you were going to say something?
We're going to
Okay,
go first.
Javina,
We're going to go
Javina.
first to Javina. Go ahead, Javina.
I'm finished. I was just saying.
Javina?
Javina, you need to unmute again, please.
Yes,
Yes.
I'm here.
Go ahead. You had a comment?
Right.
You hearing me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
But apparently you are not hearing us well, or we have some
Yeah.
continued.
I think
internet
she said
problem
there was
with your
some
site.
the internet, yeah.
Right. So let's
The internet is
try that to
unstable.
go to Ms. Bihari,
Yeah.
who also had her hand.
Javina, you can also text, as Imari did.
To mention what Dr. Crawford, Dr. Claudette Crawford Brown was saying, I was talking to one of my students about what it would be like if she wanted to move, what difficulties she would encounter. So that program that you're talking about, the elements that she mentioned that she thought that would be the biggest issues for her. And she mentioned that she definitely wanted to move with her family, not as a young person going through it. So perhaps this ties into Mr. Hasford's comments as well, is that she would be missing out her culture, the food, attire, language, simply because of that same discussion we had earlier this morning about not just what we say, but how we say it, the words we use and how we portray ourselves, and that lack of community, the fact that she wouldn't know anyone. So I think the essential elements of any program to kind of bring in welcoming people and to integrate the source country, you would have to have those elements. What foods can you expect? What attire can you expect? How can you dress? Where can you navigate? How do you say certain words? Because one of the things that is common on the internet is learning about new ways to insult people, right? So things that are common in your country are not common in other countries. Like in Turkey, it's rude to give a thumbs up, I think. And we use that all of the time. All of the time, and so I think that's probably some of the elements that you guys would have to incorporate in any program. That definitely. So Leah, thank you so much.
I think it's a great point, and this can go above and beyond, because often the programs that we implement target families who are the most vulnerable. They've been already identified and referred to CAS because of certain risks. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about a broader, kind of more comprehensive, almost prevention strategy, if you want to think about it that way, mm-hmm. which could include services and connection, both pre-migration, right, in the country of origin, post-migration, right, in the host country as well, to really streamline and facilitate, that integration and assimilation process. Yeah. Just one quick point I would want to just add on something Dr. Crawford Brown said earlier around the resources. I think the information, psychosocial supports are critical, but so is the economic, and access to capital. Because especially if someone is coming and it's about, exploring economic opportunities, it's more entrepreneurial driven, whether that be someone wants to establish a business in the host country or in the country of origin going back, the access to capital is a major, major, major barrier. But we know there's a substantial middle class of Black, African Caribbean Black populations. And we haven't really, I don't think, leveraged on the resources, in that area. So I think another key piece of the interventions we develop should also include some kind of investment strategies, right? And ways to help people access capital. Yeah.
And I'm glad you said that, Dr. Hasford, because just some research that I just completed in Trinidad with the Venezuelan migration situation, that was a major finding where the migrants come and they are unable. It's not that they want to stay in the country.
Yeah. She frozen?
She does appear to be frozen, which is really unfortunate because we do want her to
Yeah.
do some wrap up here soon.
Yeah, but-
This idea of, so it kind of wraps me around to something you said at the beginning, where Mackenzie's institutional racism he defined with a lack of action to eradicate.
Yes.
And that's, there's a passivity implied in that. As I've tuned in more to this concept of institutional racism, I've really tuned in more to an active rather than an inactive measure of institutional racism. And the access to capital brings that back up in my mind, in that it was very common from my understanding that if I'm a banker and I'm going to make a loan, I choose to be sure that the color of your skin matches mine.
Yes.
And that's not a passive thing. That's a negative active thing. And that for me, as I was thinking about this, the bit that came to mind relates to our current situation with the shooting in Atlanta. And what I was really happy to hear was our vice president iterating that it's the concept of othering, regardless of where that othering happens, whether it be somebody from Trinidad and Tobago othering people from Jamaica, or people, as you described, Dr. Hasford, the different segments of the ACB population in your area, othering one another.
Yes.
It's that othering that creates that conflict. So very, very intriguing. Sorry, I babbled on trying to fill a little bit of time there waiting for Dr. Williams to come back in. And I'm going to try, if you're okay with continuing, we will continue. This has been a lot of very informative, engaging conversation. And I see that Dr. Crawford Brown has her hand up for comment. And
Dr. William?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, the low resource and the third world experience with technology. We had a power outage. It's a real challenge, and we're in rural Jamaica. And I would suspect that the trainees who were here with us as well from Village Academy would have had similar challenges because it affected the entire district. But I was making the point about the economic situation right now with the Venezuelans and their lack of access to banks and to different things that would help to strengthen their economic capacity. And definitely, I just wanted to reinforce that point that Dr. Hasford made in his presentation of how important it is. So the systemic and institutionalized discrimination that manifests in so many ways that we need to be mindful of as we tackle this migration phenomenon. And if we are to truly help people, that we do it in very meaningful ways, looking at the entire system, all the systems affecting them, the psychosocial, the economic, the social, cultural, etc. Yeah. And I know we have plans to do some interesting work in the country here, Dr. Hasford, as it speaks to the psychosocial and the spirituality aspect as it is linked to the land and agriculture. So we look forward to that as we work on doing something different, innovative in this time.
And as we speak to that, Dr. Williams, it sounds as if this is pointing to the need for some kind of using the technology as best as we can to provide a broad, whether it's a website or Facebook pages or whatever. We have to run with the times and possibly I'm thinking of this new arrivals program which I proposed from the 80s and it was implemented in the 90s in Connecticut. I see us moving a step ahead and broadening the scope of a new arrivals program to include resources. We have already developed resources here in Jamaica where I've done therapeutic storybooks for older children, adolescent
Yes, yes.
children, the paper dolls, Precious Leaves Paradise with her Precious My Paper Doll from Paradise, teaches children about self-esteem, racism, colorism, and
Yes.
these books are already available.
Mhm.
These video based animated little snippets are available for use by your agencies, social service agencies, etc. Why can't we add to that and provide some forum of resources for economics, for setting up a business? That can all be done now. Since COVID, we've all learned to
Yes,
use
yes,
all manner
yes.
of the animations or whatever.
Time for
We can easily
innovation.
put that together.
Yeah.
Right. We can easily put that as professionals from the Caribbean, wherever we are in the world. We can help you to put that together. So you have platforms that are ready and waiting. Once the host country has done its work, those new arrivals are going to need a lot of support. Can we, probably as a group after this, because I'm thinking where we're going to go after the students present, possibly put together platforms where you in Canada can have resources to storybooks, posters,
Yes.
videos, on all manner of things, which we, as the persons who are experts, will provide culturally appropriate knowledge
Yes.
and tools, so that you don't have to be reinventing the wheel. And so that is what I wanted to throw to you, that there are resources there. Can we build on that, and we can use the technology to be able to provide the legal, as Dr. Williams is saying, the
Yes.
psychosocial, the legal, the economic, the cultural
Everything.
pieces that you
Yes.
need to prevent our kids being disadvantaged and being discriminated
Pulling together the
and
micro
their family.
yes, pulling together the micro, the meso, and the macro systems. I don't know,
Macro.
did we acknowledge the comments made by Brian Brown? Very good.
We have not yet.
Yes.
Looking for that opportunity, but Dr. Hasford, I sensed that you were trying to reply to Dr. Crawford Brown.
Okay.
And
I was validating what I think what she's saying is bang on. So not
Yes.
reproducing the wheel and building on the tradition. So yeah.
So Dr. Williams, as you were talking
Yes.
about that, the element of wrapping around, I was reading Brian Brown's note, and the idea he ends with is persons should build and increase the economy for all. And that's what I sensed you talking about in some of your welfare system elements of making sure that what we're doing, wherever we're doing it, that we are inclusive for everyone.
Right.
You have his note up. I'll leave it to you if you'd like to read more of Brian's
Yeah,
note.
he really said, good morning, persons migrate to other countries due to inconsistencies in their country. Yeah, persons migrate because of that. As Javina mentioned, job opportunities as well as better development of themselves. Two main reasons for migration. As it relates to the COVID-19 in Jamaica, it seemed that enormous nursing personnel migrate because of lack of PPEs and salary. Persons should return to their original country to further develop the economy and provide more jobs. That is essential for the development and improvement of our connections with other countries. So persons, he's calling for persons to build and increase and boost the economy for all. Excellent point. And then we have Mr. Broom, who has joined us, who says, I think this is Mr. Broom's comment. I saw it come a while ago. Did it? Hold on, that's in attendees. So it should be in attendees. Do you see Mr. Broom's comment?
Yes, I do. Yep.
Yeah,
from
I lost
Mr.
it.
Broom, with the understanding that there are a multitude of challenges of racism, economic, cultural, et cetera, what would be the first 5 steps that we could take to begin to rectify the internal problems in communities?
Right.
And we answered some of that already.
Yes, Dr. Hasford, you've captured some of that before Dr. Broom joined the conversation, but a recap is always beneficial.
Yeah, it's a huge question, and I mean I think some of the key things are being able to build capacity for locally tailored programs, interventions that address people's psychosocial needs broadly, you know. And I know it's a general framework, but you know the thing with what we sometimes call complex social problems or wicked problems is that they're just inherently complex, and so there's no one size fits all, but we can guide it with certain principles, right? So I think one of those principles would be interventions and strategies that are grounded in community driven, culturally relevant, locally specified, right? And that address psychosocial issues broadly, right? In Canada, we use the wraparound. I think another key piece has to do with the political dimensions, because we always have to keep in mind that the inequities and the drivers of migration, the economic drivers in particular, are driven by kind of a global system of policies and practices that impoverish entire nations and that prevent people from kind of realizing their full potential. So I think a big part of it as well is the political capacity building, you know, and activism. So getting young people involved in understanding what's happening in terms of politics, linking with other parts of the diaspora, right? So again, we have big Jamaican populations in Canada, in parts of the US, in the UK. And so how can folks who are kind of similarly minded leverage their resources and that brilliance to challenge the current, you know, global system, right? To address some of those policy, those structural issues. I think building kind of as an extension of that is building kind of local economies, which, you know, can create jobs and meaningful kinds of jobs that are sustainable and that retain and keep wealth within one's home community is a critical strategy. I could go on. I mean, the education system, it's hard to really pin it down. You know, I think there's so many different aspects to this question. Please, multifaceted, yeah.
Multidimensional. Yes, and there's a last question regarding the fact when you have some unwillingness, you might see that question there.
Yes, secondly, I can read it. Secondly, that's from Mr.
Willingness
Broom.
on the part of the host country, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Help. How do we get over that? And I come back to the simple fact that we use our Caribbean roots, we use our African roots, we use our the nations or the nationals who are already rooted within the diaspora to supplement whatever is taking place in North America. So Dr. know that you have a ready pool of persons here in the Caribbean with the necessary skills and resources, and we create our own resources. COVID is teaching that now. Look at what Cuba is doing with vaccines, and look what's happening where the first world said, oh, let's just clear off the shelf and just keep the vaccines for ourselves. The reality is, if we can strengthen, like what Cuba is doing, the resources in the Caribbean and rely on ourselves, because we have learned the hard way that we cannot rely on everybody else. So let's just draw the line in this and here and now and realize that here in the Caribbean, we have resources that can be used to help those kids once they go abroad. And let us use the Zoom and the whatever platforms to allow that to happen. Luckily, the technology is such that we no longer are bound by our borders, but let us reach across borders and help our compatriots to deal with those issues, which are it's not rocket science. We've done this before in small pockets. I do a lot of work in Europe helping them with African refugees, with Syrian refugees. Let's replicate and look at those models and see how we can help our own people in a Toronto, in a New York, in London, anywhere in the world. It's easy now that we have the technology.
Dr.
So that
Brown,
would be my answer to that question.
What you're also highlighting too is the importance of Caricom and the Caribbean countries coming together. Because when you listen to scale, when you listen to Dr. Hasford say how many millions, 30 million people in Canada, and we in Trinidad and Tobago 1.3 million, and Jamaica just a little over 2 million. We're a little pebble in the ocean. We need to pull together as Caricom community, as a Caribbean community, and pool these resources, indigenize, innovate, That's what we need to do.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then we will empower ourselves. We will have the resources because we understand our problems more than anything else. And as I shared with you, that classic case of the UK, and I say it because I know we do not have a UK representative, but yet the UK has been instrumental as well in migration in the Caribbean. But just to draw your attention to the case of Victoria Climby, who died in 2000 in the UK, and her case is what had ignited the Every Child Matters policy. When they looked deep into it, when the inquiry was done, and seeing all the cultural issues, institutional discrimination, all the other issues that affected migrants who were in the child welfare system. So excellent points, and I hope that we have stimulated the minds of these young people here today. Dr. Hasford, as usual, great presentation, always bringing food for thought. Do you have any final words to say before I summarize and give the task to the young people for April 20th?
Just again, I think just reiterate that thank you, for inviting me. Thanks to all the panelists, and the host for your very thoughtful contributions. The students as well. I've been really, really impressed with the dialogue in the chat and the questions that came about. This is exciting, and it's grounds for optimism, that we have folks who are thinking deeply about issues and about empowerment in our community. So this was a great way to start the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. So
I'm sorry, I apologize that I have to sign off for another meeting.
Yes.
But
okay. Yeah. Thank you. We'll keep the conversation going.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hass.
Right. So, and we acknowledge Mrs. Moraldo Bowen's point. Yes, we need to keep Caricom active and use it to the fullest potential. So true. So we have projected there the outline of this webinar, this migration webinar series, which for many young people, it falls under history, geography, social studies, life and employability skills. For us in the Caribbean, abroad, even in civics, yes? And we have could you scroll up a bit for me, please, Mr. Carver? So we see again over the last 4 weeks, we had Dr. Brown and myself presenting migration and sociocultural awareness, where we looked at the social and cultural context of migration. We had Mr. Broom joining me as co-presenter, who presented on child lifers and the experiences of Caribbean migrants in the juvenile penal system in the United States of America. In session 2, we had the Migrant Workers and Food Harvesting presentation by Mr. Henry of Village Academy and Dr. Esnad of the University of the West Indies in Mona, St. Augustine, who talked about the experiences of the seasonal farm workers and the importance of promoting food security and locating it in the globalized space that we are in. And then last week, we had Dr. Crawford Brown, who presented on migration and family separation, attachment and loss issues. And this week, Dr. Hasford, who you just met, who focused on migration and child and youth welfare issues. So now, students, it's your turn on April the 20th to present. We have given you enough food for thought. You have heard presenters from Canada, from the USA, from Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica. We are going to give you a few tasks and you will have 15 minutes to present. Teachers, we are encouraging you. You will liaise with us, let us know who are the presenters and what's their topics. I'm going to project for you, Mr. Carver, if you can allow me to share screen, please, the questions to consider as you prepare your presentation for next week. And
the 20th.
For the 30th, sorry, the 20th of April, not next week, but the next session. All right, the 20th of April, you have 15 to 20 minutes to present, because you have some great suggestions, as you have demonstrated throughout these presentations. And the questions are here. And feel free if you wish to add a new question, but these are simply to stimulate your thinking and prepare. How could more positive outcomes be promoted for migrants? How could you make the migrant children and young people feel more comfortable? What are the experiences of parents left behind, and what can be done? And what research can you find about the role of the UK as in the Caribbean voluntary migration? And you may do some Google searching and find out about the Windrush generation, and find out too that some of your own parents, grandparents may have been part of that generation. Yeah. So grandparents, yeah, and great grandparents. So I know definitely for me, my grandfather was part of that group. So we're leaving it up to you to come forward with these presentations, provide some solutions. We already saw that you have some great ideas, you have innovative minds there, and we are opening up the floor for you. We will be your audience on April the 20th. All right, if you all have any questions now, feel free to ask.
Could I add, Khadija, that between now and then, if they need to contact us, we'll put up information as to how to reach us. They can call us as resource persons to ask for any help that they might need when they're putting their thoughts together. So I'm going to ask Mr. Carver to get that out, so that we can be resource persons for them as they think.
Right.
About how to,
excellent.
Yes,
So
I don't have that
yes.
prepared to put up in a slide, but certainly everybody that is on the call has my email address.
Right.
And teachers also have Dr. Williams' email address and Dr. Crawford Brown's, I believe. So
yes.
if all else fails, please contact me and I will absolutely share that with folks.
Excellent.
To put you in touch with any of our presenters that we've had for the 4 weeks. So I will close out with saying thank you all, especially Dr. Crawford Brown, Mr. Sidney Henry, Dr. Khadija Williams, for assisting and pulling and really doing the bulk of the work to pull all of these presenters together. It's been so informative. I hope the students appreciate all of the effort and information that's been shared with them, and can really use it to inform some of their own lives going forward. And we look forward to April 20th being with you, and on behalf of Video Conferencing for Global Learning and with appreciation for Zoom, thank you all for joining in. Have a wonderful day. See you on April 20th.
Bye, y'all. Take care. It's been a pleasure.
Take care, everyone. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.